On a cold, rain-slicked Thursday evening in the heart of Atlanta, as neon signs flickered through a haze of mist and traffic roared past puddle-ridden sidewalks, 9-year-old Ayanna Marshall clutched her tattered backpack tighter to her chest and shuffled through the growing darkness, her stomach groaning from a hunger she'd grown used to silencing. Her frayed hoodie soaked through from hours of walking, with nowhere to go but forward. She passed glimmering restaurants whose aromas felt like cruel whispers, their polished doors a barrier between her reality and the world of warmth and abundance. Inside, until she reached the glowing threshold of King's Prime Steakhouse, the fanciest eatery on the block, its brass handles gleaming and doormen standing like guards at the gate to a forgotten kingdom. Ayanna stood still, shivering, her eyes fixed on the heavy oak doors, as suited men and well-dressed women laughed, kissed, and walked into a place where meals cost more than her mother's rent used to be before the layoff, before the eviction, before everything collapsed, and she gathered the little courage she had left in her small frame and approached the edge of the valet circle. Ignored at first, until one of the valets noticed her and barked, "Hey, you can't be here. Go on now." But she didn't run this time. She couldn't, because something in her felt too heavy to move, and her eyes locked on the door opening again. And out stepped a tall man in a tailored navy trench coat, silver, cufflinks flashing, carrying a small white bag in one hand. Clearly leftovers from a lavish dinner, and Ayanna's feet moved before her mind caught up, crossing the sidewalk in timid steps until she stood right in his path, rain dripping from her hair, voice shaking, eyes wide with both fear and unbreakable resolve, as she said, barely above a whisper, "Sir, ... can I please have that?" And for a beat, the world stood still. The valet stopped mid-step, the door held open by a stunned hostess, and the man looked down, his brows knitting in brief annoyance until his eyes locked with hers and time folded inward, because Elijah King, billionaire tech magnate, known for his relentless logic and bottom-line ruthlessness, didn't see a beggar or a street child in that moment. He saw something that stirred long-buried memories, his own childhood. In a crumbling Detroit duplex, scraping together meals with his mother, being told he was nothing. And here she was, Ayanna, soaked, starving, and yet holding herself with a dignity and desperation that pierced through his cold exterior. And instead of handing over the bag, he bent down, knelt to her level, and asked, "What's your name, sweetheart?" And though startled, Ayanna answered, "Ayanna," clutching her stomach as if that might quiet its protest. And Elijah stood and did something no one, including himself, expected. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "Come inside. You're eating with me," causing a ripple of whispers through the restaurant staff and nearby onlookers. And Ayanna hesitated, eyes darting to the valet, who frowned. But Elijah said, "She's with me," and that was the end of it. Inside, the hostess stammered, unsure, but Elijah's reputation silenced protest, and he led her to a private booth in the back, ordered soup, steak, mashed potatoes, and dessert without blinking. All the while sitting across from this little girl who held her fork as if it might be taken from her, eating slowly but deliberately, eyes always on the door, as though she didn't trust this magic to last. And as they ate, she told him things she hadn't told anyone, how her mom lost her job at the clinic, how they were living in a church shelter now, how she wanted to be a doctor someday because she once helped save a bird, and it made her feel powerful, and Elijah, who had closed million-dollar deals over dinners less meaningful, found himself absorbing every word, struck by the sharpness in her mind, the resilience in her tone, and the way she held on to hope like a lifeline. And when dessert came, a slice of chocolate cake bigger than her hand, he saw her hesitate, again not because she didn't want it, but because sharing food had always meant less for her mother. And so he quietly asked if her mother had eaten today, and when she said no, he ordered another meal to go without ceremony, texting his driver to meet them out front. Once she finished, he walked her back through the stunned crowd of diners and staff, handed the doorman a $100 tip without breaking stride, and guided her gently to his car, a sleek black Bentley, idling at the curb, and told the driver, "We're making a stop," as he slid in beside her and watched her fidget with the plastic container now warming her lap, her hand still trembling slightly. And during the drive, she pointed out the shelter in a neighborhood he never visited, nestled behind a rundown laundromat where her mother, pale and coughing, waited anxiously by the door and gasped upon, seeing her daughter exit the luxury vehicle with a stranger. But Elijah approached calmly, introduced himself, offered the food with a humble explanation, and when Ayanna's mother, Tasha, realized who he was, her tears started, not out of fear, but from shock, because she had once read about him in the news and could not understand why a man like that would stop for a girl like hers. Elijah didn't stay just long enough to say, "I want to help," before slipping a card with his assistant's number into her hand and disappearing into the night. But back in his penthouse overlooking the skyline, Elijah didn't sleep that night. He stood by the window, staring at the city lights, Ayanna's eyes haunting him, their fire, their hunger not just for food, but for a life bigger than the one she'd been handed. And in that moment, something changed in him, something shifted. Loose from the hardened shell he'd built over years of ruthless ambition, and he knew he couldn't walk away from her story. That little girl had asked him for leftovers, but given him back something far greater: purpose. Elijah King hadn't slept that night, his mind playing over and over the quiet strength in Ayanna's voice as she recounted her mother's illness, the eviction, the school dreams she still held onto like sacred treasure, and the way her tiny hands clutched that paper bag like it held the last ounce of her hope. He'd built empires, crushed competitors, and sat across world leaders. Yet he had never felt more powerless and humbled than when he stood in that cold alley, looking into the eyes of a little black girl who carried dignity like royalty, despite wearing threadbare shoes and patched-up jeans. The next morning, Elijah did not step into his office as usual, nor did he attend his executive meeting. He instead returned to that shelter, not in a sleek suit, but in simple clothes, drawing curious glances as he waited by the front desk with a tray of breakfast and a laptop bag. And when Ayanna came out, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her cautious surprise melted into a warm smile that reached deep into the creases of Elijah's hardened heart. Over pancakes and orange juice, he asked her about her grades, her school, her favorite books, and what she would do if life gave her every opportunity. Ayanna, blinking thoughtfully, replied that she'd open a hospital for families who couldn't afford care, and Elijah, swallowing the lump in his throat, decided right then that her dream was no longer just a wish, it was a mission. From that day on, Elijah became a silent guardian in Ayanna's life. He funded her school fees anonymously, left warm meals at the shelter's front desk, sent books, and even arranged for a tutor named Mrs. Chalmers, an elderly former professor, who volunteered weekly to sharpen Ayanna's mind and spirit. But none of this was charity to him. It was redemption, a way to heal the parts of himself he'd long buried under steel and profit margins. Because Ayanna reminded him of who he might have been if someone had intervened when he was left in a Detroit group home with nothing but rage and a stolen library card. Elijah continued visiting in secret, avoiding the spotlight. And Ayanna, clever as she was soon suspected, her angel wasn't just a random donor, but that kind man who shared pancakes with her that morning, though she said nothing, respecting his silence. Meanwhile, Elijah faced backlash from his own board members for missing meetings and shifting funds toward what they saw as unprofitable community projects. He silenced them with a single memo: the future isn't profit margins, it's people. Like her, attaching a photo of Ayanna smiling with her science fair trophy. As months passed, he quietly bought the entire block around the shelter, refurbishing buildings, hiring locals, and building a free health clinic in honor of Ayanna's mother, who, despite battling lupus, still volunteered weekly to help other families. But it wasn't just Elijah who was changing. Ayanna began to flourish under the warmth of belief, no longer just surviving, but thriving, becoming a leader in her school, organizing food drives, mentoring younger kids, and even writing a short essay titled "What Hope Looks Like," which later went viral after Mrs. Chalmers shared it online. Elijah read it in his penthouse that night and wept. Not because of the praise the girl gave her, anonymous sponsor, but because for the first time in years, he saw himself not as a tycoon or a survivor, but as someone capable of true legacy, not in stocks, but in souls. Eventually, news crews began snooping around after rumors leaked that a tech mogul was funding shelters and schools under shell charities. But Elijah remained elusive, refusing interviews, content to let Ayanna's light shine without stealing her story, until the day she was invited to give a speech at a city youth summit, where she stunned the crowd with her poise and conviction, ending with the words, All it takes is one person to believe in a stranger, and everything can change. I know because he believed in me, and though she never said his name, Elijah watched from the back row, sunglasses on, heart full, whispering, "You changed me too, kid," while beside him, Mrs. Chalmers dabbed her eyes with a napkin and whispered, "She's going to change the world. Elijah be, 'cause you reminded her she could." Elijah never imagined that a simple act of kindness giving away leftovers would shatter the walls he'd built around himself. But as the days unfolded after that rainy afternoon with Ayanna, he realized he'd stepped into a storm of purpose, far greater than anything his multi-million-dollar corporations had prepared him for. And with each passing moment, he found himself entangled not in complications, but in something deeply human. He found himself transformed. The next morning, Elijah awoke in his penthouse, not to the cold clang of sterile silence that had marked his success, but to the echo of Ayanna's words, her wide eyes etched with hunger, defiance, and hope, eyes that demanded more than pity, more than charity. They demanded truth and presence. So he rose not with the lethargy of routine, but with the urgency of a man on a mission. The image of that little girl and her exhausted mother filling his chest with something he couldn't name. And after a brief call to his assistant, a full background check was completed, not to expose but to protect, not to judge but to support, and within hours, he had Ayanna and her mother relocated from the dangerous shelter into a bright, furnished apartment in a quiet, safe neighborhood. Warm lighting, a stocked kitchen, and locks that clicked not with dread but security. Yet even that, Elijah knew, was just the beginning. He hired a nutritionist to ensure Ayanna's health stabilized and a private tutor to catch her up in school. And to his amazement, within days, the girl's natural brilliance emerged like music and challenged ideas like someone born to lead. And though she was young, her resilience made her a force of nature. So Elijah, moved by both her potential and the countless children she now symbolized in his heart, summoned his legal team and financial advisors to launch the Ayanna Grace Foundation, an initiative aimed at providing underprivileged children with access to education, food security, and mentorship. And what began as a private act of conscience quickly blossomed into a citywide movement. For Elijah didn't merely write a check, he spoke publicly, for the first time revealing the truth of his encounter with Ayanna, not as a savior tale, but as a confession of blindness and a call to action. Media outlets picked up the story, painting him as the billionaire with a heart. But what captivated audiences wasn't just the transformation of a wealthy man, it was the truth that a hungry girl, brave enough to ask for leftovers, had altered the trajectory of an empire and ignited a public soul-searching about poverty and privilege. The foundation grew quickly, sponsors lined up, celebrities offered endorsements, and schools across the state began receiving support. But amidst all the noise, Elijah stayed grounded by one thing: Ayanna herself, who still called him Mr. Elijah and still asked innocent questions that cut to the bone, like why are some kids worth more than others? And do people stop seeing you when you get poor? And each time, Elijah sat down and answered not with power, but with humility, because she had become his mirror, his measure, his redemption. He visited her every week without fails, sometimes with books, sometimes with board games, and sometimes with nothing but time. And he marveled at how her mother, now employed and empowered, began mentoring other single mothers through a program the foundation funded, paying forward the same grace she had received. Meanwhile, within Elijah's companies, a cultural revolution took hold. Executives who once dismissed diversity training now initiated outreach programs in underserved areas. Internships were created for foster youth, and corporate profits were redirected in part to sustainable community partnerships. Wall Street raised its eyebrows at first, worried about the softening of his strategy, but they were soon silenced by the data. Public trust surged, employee retention improved, and Elijah's ventures soared, not in spite of his heart, but because of it. Still, Elijah didn't care about the applause. He cared that when he looked into Ayanna's eyes now, he saw joy, potential, laughter, and something he hadn't known how to name before. On the one-year anniversary of their meeting, the foundation held its first gala, where Ayanna, dressed in a sparkling blue dress she had picked herself, took the stage to speak, her voice clear and commanding as she told a room full of billionaires, celebrities, and politicians. I used to think I was invisible. until someone saw me not with pity, but with respect. And now, I want to help other kids be seen too." And the entire room rose to its feet. Not just for her words, but for the undeniable truth that greatness is not born in privilege, but in courage, and that one child's dignity had become the heartbeat of a revolution. Elijah wept quietly that night, knowing that he had not changed the world alone, but because a little girl's eyes had reached into his soul, cracked him open, and given him back his own humanity. He had simply followed the miracle she'd sparked, and in doing so, discovered that the most powerful investments aren't in stocks or buildings, but in lives, in moments, and in love that multiplies when it's shared. Years had passed since that rainy afternoon when a hungry little girl approached a man outside a luxury restaurant asking for his leftovers. And yet the impact of that moment continued to ripple outward, transforming not just the lives of those directly touched, but entire communities, institutions, and even the definition of success itself. Ayanna, once the thin, wary girl with fire in her eyes, had blossomed into a remarkable young woman, her hair now worn in proud coils. Her shoulders squared with confidence, her gait purposeful, her voice calm but powerful. Each step of her journey a testament to what could be unleashed when someone was not just saved, but empowered. And as she stood now behind a gleaming podium at the nation's most prestigious medical school, dressed in her crisp white coat, her name stitched neatly over her heart, a packed auditorium held its breath. Not just in anticipation of another graduation speech, but in reverence of a living, breathing story of grit, grace, and the miracle of being seen. The banners above her head read Harvard Medical School Commencement. But what stole the spotlight that day wasn't the institution, it was the girl who had once been forgotten by the system, standing now as a newly minted doctor, her presence commanding, her truth undeniable. And as Ayanna looked out over the sea of faces, some smiling, some tearful, many holding cameras, her gaze settled on one man in the front row, older now, hair streaked with silver, eyes glistening with the kind of pride that words couldn't contain. Elijah Cross, the billionaire who once offered a meal and ended up discovering his soul. Beside him sat Ayanna's mother, glowing with health and joy, holding his hand not out of dependence, but as a partner in purpose. And as the applause faded, Ayanna took a deep breath and spoke not with the polished cadence of a rehearsed speaker, but with the raw, resonant truth of someone who had lived every word, her voice cracking just enough to remind everyone that this wasn't fiction, this wasn't charity, was a revolution birthed from hunger, dignity, and love. "There was a time," she began, "when I believed I didn't matter, that being hungry meant being invisible, that asking for help made me small, that silence was safer than hope. But one day, I met someone who didn't look away, someone who offered me food and ended up feeding my future." And a hush fell over the crowd as she continued, recounting the night she met Elijah, the home he found for them, the tutoring, the laughter, the first books, the safe sleep she'd never known before, and how through every stage school, science fairs, scholarships, surgeries, he showed up, not as a savior, but as a believer, always reminding her that she was not broken, just waiting to bloom. She spoke of her mother, who had found her strength again, becoming a mentor and advocate, leading women out of shelters and into careers. And she spoke of the Ayanna Grace Foundation, which had since grown into an international organization serving over 12 million children with education, nutrition, and mentorship in over 30 countries. Its reach made possible by a single shared moment between a child and a man who chose to listen, to believe, and to act. The audience comprised of world leaders, medical pioneers, activists, and alumni rose to their feet in unison, not just to applaud a speech, but to honor a truth that greatness can rise from anywhere, that potential lives in every overlooked corner, and that the smallest act of humanity can echo louder than any fortune. After the ceremony, Ayanna walked down the steps into the waiting arms of Elijah and her mother, and for a moment, they stood in silence. The three of them united not by blood, but by choice, by compassion, and by the kind of love that redefines family. Then Ayanna turned to Elijah, took both his hands in hers, and whispered, "You saw me when no one else did." To which he replied, voice heavy with emotion, "You showed me who I could be." And neither said anything more, because everything had already been spoken between them in every moment of courage, every sleepless night of study, every child fed, every home rebuilt, every heartbeat of purpose. Elijah later stepped back to let Ayanna shine fully on her own, but he remained her greatest cheerleader, attending lectures she gave across the globe, fundraising for the expansion of the Foundation's medical wings, and in the quiet of his remaining years, writing a memoir not about his wealth or ventures, but titled Leftovers, chronicling how the smallest portion of compassion ended up being the most valuable investment of his life. Ayanna, now Dr. Ayanna Grace Ellis, launched community clinics in underserved neighborhoods, each clinic named after a child who once came through their program, and every waiting room bore a mural painted by local youth that read, "You are seen, you are valued, you are loved." The world, once too busy to notice the cries of the hungry, now had fewer children in need, fewer mothers afraid, and more people ready to say yes to someone else's moment of desperation, all because one little girl asked for leftovers and instead received the full plate of humanity, courage, and destiny.